Excellent. So thank you for attending tonight's Social Inclusion webinar, our Psychologists for Peace interest group online event, which will run from 6:30 p.m. till 7:30 p.m. It's always great to gather together to discuss pertinent and important topics, and I really hope that you enjoy tonight's session and have your questions ready for our presenter, Andrea. My name is Ariane Vagona, and I am a student representative for the Psychs for Peace, and I would like to introduce and welcome my co-host, Anne Sanson, who is a longtime member of the Psychs for Peace and the current secretary. But before we begin, I'd of course like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and all the lands that you all join us from tonight. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So please feel free to share the country from which you join us from tonight in the chat function below. Before we start tonight's proceedings, I'd like to give some background to the Psychologists of Peace interest group of the Australian Psychological Society. So we are an interest group of the Australian Psychological Society. Its members are psychologists and others who are concerned about the prevalence of war and conflict in our world, and are interested in applying their professional skills to issues relating to promoting peace and preventing war. We are working to promote peace in the world and prevent conflict through psychological research, education, and advocacy. And we hold several events throughout the year, mostly online, and everyone is welcome. So please keep an eye on your inboxes too. So the order of tonight's proceedings will be as follows. So we'll hear from Inclusive Australia's CEO, Andrea Pearman, who will speak to us on social inclusion in the context of the new Social Inclusion Index that was released earlier this year. We will then finish with questions. So again, please have your questions ready by using the chat function or unmuting yourself at a later stage. A little bit about Inclusive Australia and our wonderful speaker tonight. So Andrea is a purpose-led executive who has spent much of her career leading corporate social responsibility and social impacts in complex, large-scale organisations, including the National Australian Bank and Telstra. So Andrea co-founded Inclusive Australia in response to the widespread prejudice and discrimination experienced by many groups in Australia. So in her role at Inclusive Australia, Andrea works with numerous cross-sector organisations to foster more diverse and inclusive workplaces and communities using robust data and behavioural science, which we'll hear more about now. So the ultimate vision of Inclusive Australia is an inclusive country where all people feel like they belong and they're valued. So such an important social issue that I too am very passionate about. So I'm thrilled to have you here tonight, Andrea, to discuss how we can improve social inclusion in Australia. So thank you again, and over to you now.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you about a topic I'm very passionate about tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands which I'm meeting to today. I'm in Fitzroy, so the land of Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and also to any elders we may have on the Zoom call today. So thank you. I might start by just a short presentation, so I'll just share my screen. Bear with me. Can we see that okay? Perfect. I want to start by telling you a little bit about our logo, because the logo is a very deliberate attempt to capture a lot of elements that we really believe are important to inclusion. Firstly, that you'll see there's obviously the Southern Cross, and we have all these circles. And really the circles are meant to represent that none of us actually belong to one place. Many of us belong to many circles. We're part of many, many groups. We're also not one thing. We're made up of many, many ingredients. But at the end of the day, you know, if we live in the lands of Australia, we all live under the Southern Cross, the same stars. We all breathe the same air. We all have blood running through our veins. So our tagline, "Difference is Human," is saying that we're all made up of different ingredients. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings that at the end of it want to be loved, cared for, respected, and valued for who we are. So at Inclusive Australia, we measure social inclusion, which is a very multifaceted concept through a number of dimensions. So one of our partners is Monish's Behaviour Works Australia, And we look at social inclusion through 5 aspects. Firstly, we look at individual levels of belonging and well-being. We look at in contact and friendship with minority groups to the extent to people engage with groups that are diverse. We look at people's attitudes, prejudicial attitudes and experiences of discrimination, both minor discrimination, everyday types of discrimination, and also major discrimination. And we look at people's willingness to volunteer for social inclusion and also advocate for social inclusion. So the social inclusion index itself tells both a very positive story, but also a sort of a darker story in areas where we really need to improve. I'll apologise in my advance. My mouse was sometimes a little bit slow in switching screens. So where are we at in Australia? To date, we've surveyed about 11,000 Australians over the past probably 5 years now. And as I mentioned, there's 2 sides of the story. Right now, nearly 1 in 4 Australians have recently experienced a form of major discrimination. Major discrimination like being unfairly denied a job, by being treated poorly by the police. And we know through the research that those people who experience major forms of discrimination or lots of everyday minor discrimination, we know that it impacts their well-being, and up to 15%. So it is an issue when people are experiencing these sorts of discrimination in our society. We also know that whilst a lot of Australians aren't prejudiced, there is a sizable minority that are. And that prejudice is more directed at Indigenous Australians and racial and religious minorities. And whilst that's coming down, which is pleasing, it's still very, very high and something that we need to look at. We also know that many Australians have little to no contact with certain minority groups. And we know that contact is actually associated with higher levels of prejudice. And that makes sense, because if you don't know someone from an Indigenous background and all you read is in the media, then often you'll form views and perceptions about people, that are more negative. And so it's really, really important through the work that we do that we try and raise awareness and foster as much of that contact with diverse groups as we possibly can. The good news of the story is that there is this enormous goodwill in our society, with almost 50% of our Australians, 60% of our Australians wanting to do something about discrimination when they see it, willing to support or advocate on behalf of minority groups. So the sort of work we try and do is not just understand the problem, but really try and give people proactive solutions and actions that they can do to try and prevent discrimination, prejudice when they see it. The social inclusion index, as you can see, like any long-term index, it's fairly stable. Many of you may be across the Scanlon Cohesion Index, the same thing. It's quite stable at a macro level. But what sits underneath the index is these sub-indices, as I mentioned, related to the attributes of the index I showed before, and they do move around. So you can see, for example, over time, our sense of belonging and well-being has been eroding, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be in a moment. But also over the past couple of years, probably more from a practical sense, people's ability to be able to volunteer and advocate through COVID lockdowns and a whole range of things has dropped. But pleasingly, now that particularly Victorians are allowed out again, then that has gone up again and sort of building a bit more momentum. Now, in terms of the impact on COVID, unsurprisingly, society probably remained pretty resilient in terms of the index. There were some changes, as I mentioned, around things like being able to volunteer and advocate. Probably sense of well-being was probably low in decline, but accelerated it a bit more in the last 2 years. But COVID sort of had some upsides. For example, access to working from home and flexible working, all things that are about, improving sense and well-being and control in people's lives. But obviously things like financial stress, connection to family and friends, and obviously the education piece for kids was a real negative. But generally COVID, what we've seen is that COVID hasn't had a long-term impact on the social index like we may have expected to see, so which is a good thing. In terms of discrimination, what you'll see on this graph is that probably not surprising to this group, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders experience the most discrimination of any group in our society, followed by young people, actually. I don't know if that's surprising to you, but you know, young people do call out you know, discrimination a lot, and that's both everyday and major discrimination. You'll see, interestingly enough, in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander columns, is that around 2018, there was a substantial spike in discrimination. And we're really not sure what has driven that. And Reconciliation Australia's Barometer Index actually shows the same thing. So something within the community around that 2018 really saw the spike. And maybe it's because Indigenous people felt more comfortable reporting discrimination, or maybe it was, maybe there was just more of it in relation to some of the agitation that's been happening around, you know, things like Black Lives Matters, or pre that, you know, incarceration, deaths and things like that. So we're really not too sure, and we've been keeping an eye on that. The spike in young people was actually the start of COVID. And you remember with all the lockdowns, there was a lot of complaining about young people having parties and, you know, going out. And basically this was in response to them being treated poorly by police and media, but also who was the first to lose their jobs? Often young people were in you know, unsecure employment. So they saw an enormous spike in discrimination over that period of time. Thankfully, that has come down. And then, sorry, let me just have it here. And so then what we'll see in terms of the types of major discrimination is generally, if people are going to be discriminated against, it tends to be fairly consistent across all groups. The two biggest reasons for discrimination are basically not being hired for a role or being unfairly denied. So recruitment is a huge issue in our society in terms of putting up barriers for people, in terms of being included into a workplace. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, it's often being discouraged from training and also education, and young people it's being discouraged from education. So those fundamental, I guess, rights we have to work, to education, remain the biggest barrier and discrimination that people experience. And as I said, it comes back to being the biggest contributor to well-being as well. In terms of everyday discrimination, these are things like, you know, being treated poorly by someone, being treated like, you know, you're stupid, sort of smaller things, more subtle forms of discrimination that happen every day. So again, you will see that, you know, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are right up there. Thankfully, that's declining a little bit, followed by young people again. And again, the types of discrimination every day was being treated as other people were better than you, being treated with less courtesy or respect, or again, mentioned as treated if you weren't so smart. My personal view is the everyday discrimination is something that I don't think is on the radar of many organisations. I think a lot of people are doing great work around recruitment processes and sort of the more major types of discrimination, but more subtle forms of discrimination, I think, are still quite pervasive, and I don't think we're really facing into those. And you know, my personal reflection is I mean, there's very few cafes I walk into these days, very few shopping centres or supermarkets that don't have a sign on the door saying, please don't be rude to our staff. And, you know, you sort of see that. So in some ways, you know, I think as a society, we've kind of lost some of our fundamental values and, you know, respectful behaviours. I think that's really worth us, you know, doing a lot more around. I wanted to touch on intersectionality as well, and just show you that, you know, when we look at even the 50% of Indigenous Australians that experience discrimination regularly, people who belong to more than one minority group do it even tougher. And, you know, people who have the lowest well-being are people who are on a disability with low income, or LGBTI groups on low income. People who experience the highest levels of everyday and major discrimination are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are part of the LGBTI community, or young people with disability. Those numbers are getting up to 66, 62%. That's huge. And so I think when we often talk about diversity, you know, particularly, for example, we're thinking about getting more women into work, into senior positions and things like that, I think we still look through a very singular lens. It's often, you know, women of privilege, and so I think what we need to be better at is really looking at how do we make sure that we bring people into roles with often, you know, a lot of multiple diverse experiences and perspectives, and really start to understand also too that intersectionality for some people, life is really, really tough. Again, I just mentioned here, 1 in 4 women experience major discrimination versus 40% of the LGBTIQ women and young women. So again, it really does make a difference. So the last point is basically saying the more minority groups you identify with, the higher the chances you'll have of discrimination. So it is definitely a challenge. I'll put this slide up because I found this incredibly fascinating. This is a question we asked this year that we haven't asked before. When people said that they'd be discriminated against, we asked them, why do you think you were discriminated against? Age and gender, number 1 and 2. Even before race or culture, which I just found fascinating. And you know, it really does make a difference. If you're a young person, you feel discriminated against. If you're an old person, you feel discriminated against. We're an ageist society. And also obviously gender as well, really, really important. And so I just think it's something, you know, as we start to do more work in this space and we look at solutions, I think these sorts of things are perceptions of what people think is driving this is also really, really important. In terms of prejudice, pleasingly, you'll see that prejudice has been declining towards some groups over the last 5 years. As I mentioned, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, racial and religious minorities have the highest levels of prejudice directed towards them, and that is thankfully going down. Again, that may just be that there's been a lot more movements such as the Black Lives Matters movement, a lot more discussion around it, a lot more organisations making efforts in this space, which is fantastic, a lot more education and awareness out there. And hopefully what we would expect to see over time is that a reduction in prejudice should correlate towards a reduction in discrimination within, you know, the community. So that's the longer term view that we would be hoping to see as a consequence of these declining trends. As I mentioned before, you know, there's a lot of people in our society that don't have contact with different groups. And we know through the research that not only is social connectedness and belonging really important for well-being, contact actually is one of the most effective ways of influencing attitudes, emotions, and behaviours. Connection is really, really important because it increases empathy and it reduces prejudice. And contact doesn't actually have to be meeting someone in person, doesn't have to be a really deliberate act. It can be as simple as telling a powerful story. And so what we use at Inclusive Betray is we do use a lot of storytelling to raise awareness of just someone's background as a really powerful tool to sort of start to really erode those prejudices and attitudes. So again, visualization, a lot of organisations use it, storytelling, incredibly powerful. And as I mentioned to you before, a lot of storytelling is important for a lot of our groups, such as Indigenous groups, many of which we don't have a huge population and often are geographically isolated. You know, when you've got 1 in 5 Australians saying they'd never, ever had contact with a religious minority and 17% saying they'd never had contact with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander group. And also, as I mentioned, contact with people with LGBTI, people with disability, and Aboriginals is actually showing promising increases. So I think if there's one thing I had to say out of all of the work that we've done, is if one thing people can do is actually create connection, and create connection through reading, through storytelling. It doesn't have to be complicated, because I think it's such a powerful lever we can all pull. The other thing I wanted to share with you is, as I mentioned to you, in the index over, we've seen a decline in wellbeing, and the decline in wellbeing that we've seen primarily has been driven by this sense of feeling part of community. And I think over the past couple of years, it's probably been a bit harder for people to feel part of the community because we've been locked away. So we have seen that decline. But it is something, when we talk about the next slide, it is something that is an interesting, I guess, disconnection that is certainly happening within local community and at the Australian level, which, again, we're not really sure what's going on. In terms of the people who have the lowest levels of connection to community, it is Indigenous people, again, and LGBTIQ plus groups. So more of those groups feel like they're more disconnected. And, you know, as I said, you know, being connected to community is so important for people's well-being. We ask people to what extent they feel connected to, they love or feel support of their local community, Australia, and humanity. And as I mentioned, this is something been going back pre-COVID, but we are seeing sort of some interesting trends that are declining down, particularly towards Australia. So not so much to that common humanity, which is great. And again, we're not quite sure what's going on. It could be that, you know, frankly, Australia and a lot of Australians have had a pretty tough time over the last 5 years. We've had, you know, bushfires, floods. We've had, as I said, you know, COVID and some incredible lockdowns. Or it could be that, you know, we're becoming a more global society where we're looking to connect with others around the globe because the world is getting smaller. So it may not necessarily be a bad thing, but it's just a really interesting trend. And, you know, if we come back to the fact that, you know, connection is so important for well-being, and if you're connected to a society, you're more likely to contribute to it and support it and care for it. You know, it's just sort of something that we need to keep on our radar, just to sort of see, you know, what are the impacts, I guess, of this disconnection with Australia moving forward. And again, the groups that identify the least with Australia are, you know, LGBTIQ plus groups and racial minorities. And in the case of LGBTIQ plus, you know, I sort of reflect on, you know, the marriage equality debates that we've had over the last, you know, 4 years. We're now having the debates around the Religious Freedom Act. I think it's pretty tough, you know, to watch a country play your life out in front of you and not be affected. So I think there's some probably pretty legitimate reasons why certain groups feel, you know, a bit more disconnected to country than others. Sorry, I just have a quick drink of water. Now, in terms of what goes on in the workplace, so for the first time this year, we asked people about the perceptions around diversity and inclusion within the organisational construct. And I guess the good news is a lot of people, 70% of people, felt their organisations were quite good at ensuring staff were from diverse backgrounds and were representative and flexible working arrangements were in place. And so that's something that's, you know, great news, and we've come definitely a long way. However, when you look at, I guess, the perceptions of inclusion, there's still a long way to go. So, you know, you've got quite a few, you know, 10 to 14% of respondents, you know, really disagreeing that if they raised a concern, they'd be confident their organisation would do the right thing, feeling like they were valued within the organisation. And, you know, around half saying that they didn't think their organisation fitted the definition of a socially inclusive workplace, is where, you know, people are treated equally regardless of, you know, culture, race, gender, religion. So as I mentioned before, I think there's some great energy around the D part of diversity and inclusion in getting, you know, setting quotas and getting targets in place. But I think the I part, which is really the softer human behaviour part, which is often harder, is where a lot of the work needs to happen within the workplace context and, you know, organisations in general. The other thing we asked people was around to what extent they felt that, you know, values, Australian values of fairness, you know, compassion, tolerance, you know, all of those values we espouse Australians to be, to what extent that we were living those values. And I think it's fair to say when you look at that, there's, you know, a huge room for improvement. And so I think our values are really powerful. And, you know, we as Australians, you know, that sense of egalitarianism and, you know, fair go is really underpins who we are. And yet when you look at this, you say we're just not living up to it, and there's a long way to go. And so I think part of the work that we try and do is really shine a light on, what we say and actually what's going on for people in our society. And so, we really want to see these things improve. And, obviously COVID has stressed these a little bit, that they're still, still weren't that fabulous before the pandemic. So how do we get human beings to be more inclusive? As I said, as psychologists, you probably have, some fabulous insights of your own on this. And so I'm not going to profess to know I know as much about the human condition as you do, but all I would say is, it's never easy. Human beings are not always, have the levels of self-awareness about the impact they have on others, or the impact that people have on them and how they react to that. There's all the human hardwiring and biases that come with being just a human being. And so I think the work that we try and do is really actively encourage people and give them the confidence to be more open, to learn more about themselves, to really start to listen and value the opinions of others, even if they don't agree with it. And I also like to say that rather than, I guess, focus on certain cohorts of people or, stereotypes of people, we really like to say, at the end of the day, we're all a work in progress, because none of us are going to be perfect. So I think owning your imperfections but trying to be better in everything you do is the way we sort of try and position this work, rather than being, I guess, accusatory of the fact that, some people over here are very virtuous and others are not. And I always say that there's, no bad people, there's just bad behavior. And that's the way we like to sort of present the work and the solutions that we have in our organisation. I've just put it up here, what is our values as an organisation, and this is what we really encourage in terms of how we talk about what you need to do and the sort of space you need to step into when you're trying to be more inclusive. And as I mentioned before, it's that openness and that willingness to open your hearts and mind, assume good intent, because none of us are going to get it right all the time. But we have to try, really listening and challenging our own assumptions, and, celebrating both our differences, but that common humanity. Respect, creating a, safe and accessible place. Some really, really simple behaviours like listening. I don't know about you, but I've sat in many meetings in my corporate life where one person has not shut up and not let anyone else speak, or been sitting on their phone all day. I honestly think it's the simple things and the everyday things that make a massive difference. Humility, and I learned this, I think this was one of my greatest anxieties when I first started this work, because how can you possibly know everything about every individual, every experience, every language, every cultural nuance? It's never going to happen. So I've just sort of said, well, I know what I know, and I'm open to learning, and every day I learn something else, but I know I'm not going to get it right. And I just need to have the humility to know that that's my imperfection, but I'm going to have a go. And that leads on to the courage, the courage to try and fail sometimes, but the courage also to not walk past the sorts of behaviours that, we shouldn't tolerate. And then finally, teamwork, these, like anything, this needs I guess, a societal effort of lots of individuals trying every day to really make it happen. So that's how we talk about our values. In terms of then how we get people to act, with our work in Monash University's behavioural science, that the one things they say to me all the time is, you actually don't have to change people's attitudes to get them to behave differently. You can actually create ways in which people can do things, and through their actions, even though they might not know why they're doing it, through their actions, you will influence their attitudes. So the idea that we do is to try and find out what are those sort of actions potentially that we can get people to take. And I've got a list of these here for you now. And I was saying to Anne before that I was looking at your 10 ways to promote peace on your Psychology for Peace. And there are a few in here that are quite similar, in the sense that, obviously talking about inclusion, talking about what it means to you, sharing thoughts through food, culture, ideas, why things like Harmony Day are so important. just constantly reading more and exposing yourself more to the views of others and their opinions. Again, it's not about saying you have to agree with everything, but just making sure that you're trying to build other perspectives. Listening and validating people who have been victims of discrimination. I mean, so many times you see people try and share their stories and it gets very uncomfortable, so people shut them down. And you know, because they're not comfortable. And I think being able to sit there and just listen and validate that. And also, you know, things like enabling participation, making sure that that person in the corner who hasn't said anything at the whole meeting is invited to talk. So again, I think with all of this stuff, making it very simple and accessible for people is really, really important, because I think sometimes we look at this work, it's so enormous, the problem is so big, we don't even know where to start. So we really actively encourage people just to start with the small things, because at the end of the day, they may not make a big difference on the national scale, but they will make a difference to that one person's life that you actually said hello to. And I remember when I went years ago, we were at a homeless shelter and I was speaking to a homeless man, and he said, you know, I can go for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or even months without someone saying my name. And so when someone stops and asks me my name and calls me my name, he said, you have no difference, no appreciation for the difference that makes to my life. And so I think, you know, we forget that. So again, just the small things actually do matter. And finally, you know, as organizations, you know, as leaders in our organization, you know, it's very well to have a, you know, diversity inclusion strategy, but then if you're not acting in accordance with it, or if you do things that contradict it, you know, it just undoes all the good work. So I think in many ways, I prefer to see people, you know, acting, and then having the great documents and strategies later, but, you know, because it's important that we do lead by example. I've included in here, and I can send the presentation around, a resource that's a link to our Inclusive Australia diagnostic. And this is a diagnostic that organisations, a free diagnostic, can undertake, which actually assesses their practices across the 10 domains. You'll see, 10 domains of practice. So it looks at things like, you know, what sort of strategies have you got in place? How are your leaders held accountable for diversity and inclusion? What training have you got? What policies do you have in place? How are you role modeling it? How are you communicating it? Have you got diversity within your communication? So it gives organizations a really good way of assessing what they're doing and then making some recommendations on what they can do to improve. So this is sort of putting the wiring in the walls of an organization to start to create the system by which they can, you know, foster a more inclusive society. I think understanding and measuring is really important too. Often organizations are really obsessed with getting all this diverse talent into the organization. They don't even know what they've got. You know, they don't even ask, they wouldn't even know if they have people from neurodiverse backgrounds or, you know, people who are gay, and if they haven't asked, or if they don't create the right sort of safe environment for people to share those sorts of things. So I think it's really important for organizations to create the space for people to tell their stories, to share their experiences, whether they're good or bad. Again, to discuss what are people's ingredients, because again, Anne and I were talking before, how many times we assume that, you know, you're an Indigenous person, then you're going to agree with every other Indigenous person. Or you're a female, you females must all think the same. It's just not true. You know, we are diversity within diversity within diversity. And so I think, you know, understanding what people's ingredients are and really trying to bring this down to we are all unique, but we all have that common humanity is really, you know, what I would encourage conversations to look like. And as teams or as groups of individuals working together, trying to ask each other questions, you know, if we wanted to create an environment where everyone feel they belong, they felt valued and respected, what would the behaviours our team look like? What would be the symbols or the processes or the actions that we would do to bring that to life? So how can we drive respectful debate? And I was talking to an amazing organisation this morning, an Indigenous organisation, who said, you know, they have cultural processes where they discuss and they debate, and they will literally pass the talking stick around, and no one's allowed to talk while that person's got the talking stick. So there are many processes and symbols and things that we can introduce that are relevant to our organizations or our groups that we belong to that would really help. And there's amazing resources. So there's a group called there's a link to Inclusive Nudges, which has got 101 ways that you can encourage inclusive actions within workplaces and things like that, which has got some great examples as well. I also think just to the last couple of points is to really create change, you've got to make it real for people every day. I see a lot of organizations, try and make changes to, whether it's their diversity inclusion practices, or it could be their, corporate social responsibility, ESG, it could be, just certain cultural attributes. Unless you actually make it practical and real for people in their everyday lives, it just is one of those things you go and do your course and then you forget about it. And so I think being able to put what I call, again, the wiring in the walls, and so people, it becomes just part of what they do. And after what is it, the 21 days of or 28 days of habits, and then it just becomes something what they do. So I guess for me, I will just stop sharing. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight as to what we do as an organisation, and hopefully some practical tools and things you can take away and apply in your own lives and your own work. I think so I might take questions now if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I think that was a fantastically thought-provoking and informative presentation. I'm sure we've all gained a lot from it. So people do put your questions in the chat, or maybe use your little hands button under the reactions if you've got a question you'd like to ask. One problem with Zoom is we don't have a talking stick we can hand around. We need to be handing a talking stick around.
I mean, while people are, I guess, getting their questions sorted, I obviously shared a lot of data and a lot of different, good stories and bad stories. I'd just be curious as to if anyone was shocked by it. Were people surprised by the extent of discrimination in our community? Maybe not. I think it depends on, obviously, your personal experience. But yeah, if anyone had any reflections they wanted to share in the chat box, or any wanted to say anything, I'd just be interested. Okay, was surprised to hear that older's sense of discrimination was low. Yeah, look, I guess in comparison to other groups, but still 1 in 4 Australians generally is still high. And what you might find is, again, I would suspect that the intersectionality would play into it as well. So I'm sure there would be groups of older Australians, there would be groups of older Australians that would experience higher levels of discrimination in that. Certainly prejudice towards older people is one of the lowest. We are not seen to be prejudiced towards older people, definitely.
Is older people defined in your survey at what age group you're talking about? Because I know that in terms of access to work, people in their 60s feel discriminated against.
Yes, age is 60 plus.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it is interesting because, obviously in that perception it does come up. But when we ask the specific questions around discrimination, they are the lower group generally, but it doesn't say they don't, it doesn't happen to them.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yehudit has a question. Do you want to unmute?
Oh, yes, thank you. I was just typing it. So I was curious. Oh, look, thank you first, Andrea. That was wonderful. Really interesting. Some things were not too surprising, but just felt a bit sad in a way, like, oh, still. And I'm curious whether you've got any data around anti-Semitism, and by that I mean both against Jews and Muslims, because it's an actually inaccurate term. Anti-Semitism actually means anti-Jews and Arabs, so it gets all mushed up together. So I'm curious if you've got, because I've got a little bit of info, but I was curious what you found.
Yeah, so we don't break the groups down to that level, but certainly the Scanlon Foundation does. So if you I mean, they've been collecting data for probably, I think they'd be close to 14 or 15 years now, and the Scanlon's Social Cohesion Index is actually a multicultural index. So they would pick up the different groups underneath that. And we often see very, very similar patterns. So, for example, during sort of, I guess, national things or issues that are cropping up, whether it was, a lot of the terrorism acts, you will see flow down effects on groups within our index, like as a racial minority, but they will see it down to the specific group, like Muslims. So and they've got a great online tool you can use to interrogate the data as well. So I'd encourage you, if you go there, you should be able to find that information.
Right. Oh, thank you. Because just a little bit of info, what we found, interestingly, in some research we looked at, was that when there's more anti-Jewish oppression, there tends to be more anti-Muslim oppression. And when there's more anti-Muslim oppression, then anti-Jewish oppression goes up as well. So maybe people get confused about who's who. I don't know. I'm not sure, but for some reason it goes together. Yeah.
Thanks, Yehudit. Joanna's got a question now.
Thank you as well for your talk. I work in older person, so I'm a bit focused on on the statistic. So I'm wondering, the older people who are in aged care facilities feel like they're not having choice. They're not having, so it's under-resourced, let's say, and so I'm surprised it's not, if the level, the sense of discrimination isn't as level, say, with low income. And I'm concerned that it's about feeling powerless, and not because you're becoming frail, you're losing, it's like you're a teenager, with all the hormones and your body's changing shape, and, you could kind of make jokes about it, but as a teenager's gaining strength, an older person is losing capacity. And so I just worry that it's sort of reflective of being disempowered.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that I'm sure that the survey would be, because what we do is we do the national representative sample sizing, then we go out and we top it up with the sort of more marginalised groups, but I suspect they probably wouldn't have gone into a nursing home context or necessarily collected data from the specific cohort that you're talking about. So you're probably right. There is a missing piece there for that cohort. So it might be something that we just need to think about, including people who are geographically isolated too, because that may not have access to online surveys. So there are limitations within the data capture mechanism, I think, that would change that should that be a different mechanism. So it's a really good point.
There's a really good question from Eliana, which addresses this question of, do we tackle attitudes or do we tackle behaviour, which comes first? And do we take a behavioural stance and say encourage behaviour and the attitudes will follow, or whether we need to be changing the attitudes first. So Eliana in the chat is talking about her work, a meta-analysis on perspective taking, the effects of perspective taking on attitudes and behaviours towards groups. And the findings suggested that behaviours are harder to change than attitudes. So she's really interested in what sorts of things what you have found has worked in terms of encouraging people to change their behaviours.
Yeah, so
the pro-social behaviours.
So I suppose, I guess, and again, I'm being informed by a behaviourist, so I'll give you my layman's version of what I understand. Is that the behaviours that we're encouraging them to do are behaviours like talking to someone that's different to them, going out and reading a story about someone that's different to them. So that it's not specifically changing their behaviours around being rude to someone, or not. It's actually, so looking firstly at the motivation to get them to do something which we know has an impactful impact on the negative behaviors. So it's the flow on effect to those. So what the work that I've given you, the top 10 behaviors on that list, are all things that we know that if people do them will have a positive impact, flow and impact onto their attitudes and those antisocial behaviours that drive prejudice and discrimination, if that makes sense. So it's sort of, that's the way I understand it. So it's not necessarily going, we're going to shift this particular behaviour around aggression towards someone. We're actually trying to firstly build empathy, get them to do something that's going to build empathy so they don't think about doing it next time around. So that's the way I understand the framing of how we think about it. But I'm sure I can connect you to my behavioural scientists at Monash if you'd like to too, because I mean, the more we can learn and the more studies we can pull in as well. Because just to also let you know that we to build our diagnostic tool that we did in workplaces, we did a literature and practice review about probably 4 years ago, and we just reran it, and the amount of data has doubled. The work in this space is just going gangbusters, and so every every year, every month, we're learning more and more, and that all of those types of learnings need to come into the study. So there's some fantastic work on bystander interventions now that we're looking at. Great work around breaking down stereotypes. So anything that people feel that they want to contribute, we'd love to learn.
Yes, it seemed to me that the suggestions that you made were all very practical and easy things, and things that people would probably sort of want to do but have a bit of hesitation, or it doesn't cross their mind to do it. Like getting into conversation with a homeless person on the street and starting off with asking their name. Very easy things, but we sometimes feel hesitant about doing it and need that encouragement. I guess one thing that I was interested in was sort of the glass half full, glass half empty side of things, when you said, we seem to be doing pretty well on diversity because your figure was around about 70%, and was that good, was that bad? That was my question. And I guess another thing that interested me was looking at your trends over time, and some of those are quite encouraging, but they're still pretty little. It was like a change from 58% to 52% 5 years later or something like that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's as fast as societies do change, but I wondered if you had thoughts on both of those sort of ways of looking at the numbers.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. I might maybe start with when we started the organisation 5 years ago, like when we started doing the work. The environment, the divisive environment to even have a conversation about an organisation that was trying to improve Australian values, we had to be so careful, because you had the likes of the Andrew Bolts and those, just the divisive conversations that would literally attack you and were so aggressive. I have to say that's changed fundamentally. So the media landscape and appetite for these conversations, particularly after the marriage equality debate, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too, the tolerance for this sort of stuff it's changed. And so I've just noticed we can be more provocative than we ever could be 5 years ago. Wouldn't have dared. So a lot of the softer language, the more optimism, the more saying, we want, we don't want to exclude everyone. There's no bad people, there's just bad behavior, is all was all deliberate at the time, when you had to be very careful how you played out that narrative. So I would say there is an optimism in terms of the fact that almost the bubbles burst on how bad things are. You know, and people are now willing to sort of start to do things. I think, you know, while I say diversity is improving, you know, it's still not great. You know, there's still not enough women in leadership positions. There's certainly not a lot of intersectionality in the people who are in the leadership group as well. So there is a long way to go. Even if we look at our unemployment figures, you know, I can tell you those unemployment figures would disproportionately be full of people with disability, with people, you know, from marginalised backgrounds, and, you know, let alone underemployment figures, because we don't talk about that. So, but I think also too, you know, I think people need a bit of hope as well. And so I think I try and make sure that I balance that story by some level of positive outcomes and positive solutions they can do. But we should, you know, we should see as things like prejudice start reducing, we should see a swing towards an increase in a decrease in discrimination as well. It's just that, you know, it's just going to take time.
Yeah. And it seems, going back to this sort of behaviour versus attitude thing, it seems to me, and the power of modelling, I guess, it does seem to me the fact that we didn't think twice about having an acknowledgement of country before we started this talk. And it's only a few years ago that wouldn't have been the norm. And that, you know, it does make you think about first Australians. And the way, at least on the ABC, which is the bubble that I inhabit, that they always make a point of saying whose land they're speaking from. Just seems to me to be a major shift.
Yeah. And the other thing I would also say is, you know, a lot of Australians are just blissfully unaware, you know, and you know, I've had a lot of conversations, and I remember, you know, talking to a bunch of real estate agents, and I remember one saying, look, you know, I think things are getting better. And you know, I said, with all, you know, due respect, you're not operating in an area where you see people that are disadvantaged. You know, you're living in a leafy suburb, you know, and so it's invisible to you. So just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think part of the work that we try and do through the research is we try and actually tell the story, so people can say, actually, this is true. You know, that this is my experience, but this is not the experience of a significant portion of our population. And that's why it is important to poke the bear and to get people, you know, aware of what is out there.
Absolutely, yeah. Ariane has her hand up. Can just see it against that beautiful background that you have.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. I just had one other kind of stat that you were talking about in mind, how people were decreasing their identification with Australia, but increasing their identification with humanity. So I would imagine the desired trend would be that we want both to increase. We want people to have kind of a global mind as well as kind of a local and community mind, and also a national mind as well, because it is the country of Australia that we're living in. So is everything that you're talking about how you would imagine you would increase that engagement with Australia, or are there other strategies that you'd think would be useful to help people increase their engagement with Australia?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and I probably only have maybe an opinion, a personal opinion, rather than anything that may be correct or not. I think we've got an unresolved business as a country. I think we're having an identity crisis right at the moment. You know, we've got this elephant in the room, and thankfully now we may be going to talk about it. But, you know, every Australia Day, we have more and more people not wanting to celebrate Australia Day, but we're pretending that it's not there. And so I don't have necessarily a problem with people having a view on whether it's the 26th or not, but I have a problem with not having the conversation. And so then what happens is people just do other things to vote with their feet and not celebrate. So I think, you know, I think we need to talk about what is the country we want to have? What is the, you know, if we have got these values, are we okay that the fact we're not living these values? And is it okay that people, you know, there's lots of people that have terrible experiences. Well, it's not okay to me, and I think it's not okay to a lot of people. And so I think we need to have a really good debate around what sort of country we want. And, you know, I think, as I said, I think the global side of it is a good thing, but it also brings with it, you know, exposure to, again, not so good cultures and not so good behaviours. And, you know, there's probably many examples of leaders over there that I'm sure you know that you're probably not role models that we'd want to do. So I think, you know, I think pleasingly humanity's still there. But I think, you know, there's more work to be done, certainly within our own backyard, to sort of, you know, create the sort of environment we want for, you know, our future generations.
Indeed. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I think that with the work that you're doing, I hadn't known about your organisation before this, and I'm very pleased to have learned about it, and I'm sure everyone else in the audience is too. But we are just about at the end of our time, so maybe Ariane would like to close up now and thank you more formally.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all here to have this discussion and to be able to speak with Andrea and learn more about the Social Inclusion Index and Inclusive Australia. So I've put the link in the chat to Inclusive Australia. And yeah, so go on, have a look at the resources. Andrea, if you'd like to share your PowerPoint slides as well with those resources, we can send them around to the list. Yeah, everyone who registered, I've already got your email, so that's fine. But yeah, thank you so much again. Any questions, feel free to email Psychs for Peace as well. And yeah, until next time, thank you again, Andrea, for your wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks,
Thank you.
Ariane and Anne.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.